I'm Edward Skidelsky. I'm director of the Committee for Academic Freedom, and this is the first debate in a series which will be running over the next 2 years at campuses around the country, open to argument. The idea is to put on debates on controversial topics at UK universities to show that it can be done robustly yet respectfully. This first debate is on the very topical subject of Trump's second presidency. Will it be good or bad for academic freedom? It's being put on in partnership with Queen Mary Afaf and Abhishek Saya, who's been our internal partner. I'll hand it over now to Dr. Anna Lutfi, who's going to be chairing the debate.
My name's Anna Lutfi, and I'm a, for want of a better phrase, human rights barrister, and I will be chairing the discussion tonight. Now, Donald Trump's administration is the most committed political administration in the world to free speech, apparently. And surely the testing ground for free speech, the most fundamental of civil liberties, is the university campus. The tendency for many Trump supporters, or those who do not share Trump's politics but have been concerned about woke authoritarianism, has been to welcome the new US administration as the beginning of a new, freer, more open-minded era for at least academic campus politics. Yet, in the wake of the October 7th massacre and the growth of pro-Palestinian student protest movements across the West, Trump has made unexpectedly loud noises about clamping down on campus expression. Earlier this month, Trump posted on Truth Social, "All federal funding will stop for any school, college or university that allows illegal protests. Agitators will be imprisoned or sent back to the country from which they came. Americans will be expelled or, depending on the crime, arrested." What is meant by illegal protest in a country protected as it is by the First Amendment? Is illegal just Trumpese for imagined far-left extremism? A new political enemy to be targeted in the same way as the so-called far-right used to be targeted, or is still targeted or demonized for any critic of wokeism? Will the war against woke in the United States restore free speech as the foundation of liberal democracy, or should we now expect to see illiberal political crackdowns on the woke, or the left, or the anti-Trumpers? What are the implications, not only for the American Academy, but for the Academy elsewhere, for example, here in the UK? And of course, the central question tonight is, as you can see behind me, is the second presidency of Donald Trump good or bad for academic freedom?
I'm not here to defend Donald Trump. I think he is an immoral, bullying narcissist who has laid claim to the country I'm from and has also traduced the brave Ukrainians who have stood up to Putin, who is a dictator. So Trump is intent on tearing up the rules-based order that has led to peace and prosperity since the war. I'm not a fan of that. However, we're not here to debate Donald Trump. We're here to debate his impact on academic freedom. And here there's a balance of forces. There's some negative and there's some positive, but my argument is there's more positive than negative. A wrecking ball may destroy a lot of good things, but it can also knock down some rotten things as well. And the main rotten thing that I think the Trump administration is knocking down is the cultural left's hegemony and grip over the modern Western university, which lies at the core of the problem of progressive illiberalism, which is at the core of the loss of free academic freedom on campus. I see there's really two threats to academic freedom. The first is what I call hard authoritarianism. That's basically your university punishing you for speech, often at the behest of agitators and activists who pressure the administration to censor your speech. A number of us have been through this process already. So that's a real threat. According to the latest FIRE surveys, 14% of American academics have either been punished or threatened with punishment for speech in teaching, research, and public commentary. So 14%, that's a significant number of academics. But it's not just that vertical top-down punishment process. There's also what I think is a more insidious process, which is the peer-to-peer horizontal discrimination. So political discrimination against conservatives, gender-critical feminists, and other political minorities is actually a more important source of threat to academic freedom because it causes people to feel a hostile environment and to self-censor. A couple of numbers here. I love numbers. I'm a social scientist. Only 1 in 10 Trump-supporting academics in the social sciences in the US would tell their political views to a colleague. In this country, it's only 1 in 5 Brexit-supporting academics in the social sciences who would divulge that to a colleague. So we have massive self-censorship going on from political minorities, typically conservatives or gender-critical feminists. The third problem we have is the lack of viewpoint diversity, the political homogeneity of the modern academy. The latest FIRE numbers from 2024 show a 7-to-1 left-to-right split in American academia. That's up from 1.5 to 1 from the 1989 survey. So we've roughly had, and other surveys show slightly different numbers, it's roughly a tripling of the left-right skew since the mid-1960s. And we're now to the point where, if we take the Ivy League, for example, political donations, it's about 98-2, Democrat to Republican. Harvard did a survey, it was about 81% liberal, 2% conservative in the Harvard faculty. So we've got a big problem of the lack of political diversity, and that makes both of these problems of punishment and political discrimination worse, because when you have a homogenous faculty, they lose track of where the middle is, and actually, as John Ellis in his book Breakdown of Higher Education writes, when you get that homogeneity, the game becomes, how do you exemplify the community's values? By being extreme. So extremism tends to take root in politically homogenous environments, and also political discrimination is much worse because the impact is on a smaller group within the faculty. So at the core of the cultural left lies what I would call DEI ideology or woke cultural socialism. This is essentially, the DE part means we want equal outcomes by race and sex, so no race gaps, no sex gaps in achievement, for example. The I, inclusion, means censorship. We can't have anybody saying anything that will cause quote-unquote emotional trauma to members of totemic minority groups. So that's DEI. It results in a number of policies, affirmative action, of course, but also compelled diversity statements if you want funding or a job, and speech codes. But it's not just those explicit speech codes and diversity statements. There is also the implicit speech codes caused by a homogenous faculty enforcing orthodoxy. You don't want to come up with a conclusion like Roland Fryer did, that actually there's no racial bias in police shootings, or you're actually going to be harassed. You might even need police protection, as Fryer did. So there is this orthodoxy and homogeneity. Now, what is the Trump administration's response to this? Now, Trump ham-fisted? Absolutely. Immoral? Absolutely. But what is the effect of what he's doing and what Musk and Doge are doing? Well, actually, they are exposing the incredible scholar activism, the incredible left-wing bias in National Science Foundation grants, for example. And they are defunding a lot of that in a ham-fisted way that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, absolutely, and I'm critical of that. However, I think it is important to expose this to the light of day and to raise awareness in the general public. For too long, universities and granting agencies have been getting away with murder on this stuff. And now, just to see the contrast between what's happening in the US, where we're actually starting to see some movement. We're starting to see some reflection. Political neutrality statements are happening. Freedom of speech statements are happening. By contrast, in my country, Canada, you go north of the border, you have research grants that are doled out on the basis of race and sex explicitly. You are white, you are male, you cannot apply for a Canada Research Chair, or you can apply, but you're going to be discriminated against. You have medical schools that are essentially open only to members of protected groups. You have speech codes, you've got diversity statements. Anyone who challenges basically nonsense narratives such as indigenous knowledge, such as land acknowledgements, gets run out of the academy, like Francis Widdowson. So that's Canada for you, where they don't have anyone doing what Trump is doing. And part of the point here is to say, I don't believe that universities can reform themselves from within. Speech codes popped up in the end of the 1980s. By 1991, there were about 300 on campus. Despite being struck down in the courts, they keep popping up. Affirmative action, despite being voted out by the California electorate, keep popping up. The universities are not going to respect, they're going to fight against anything that goes against the DEI ideology, which are the sacred values of the modern university. And so when you've got that implacable an enemy, the only thing that works is outside intervention. You need to change incentives. The primary threat to academic freedom is from the inside and from the left. The primary change can only come from the outside. So let's just see what happened in the US case. Yes, prior to Trump, we had very occasionally the stars aligning. Donald Downs writes at the University of Wisconsin, they had a committee that had, was pro-free speech for a few years. Or you have an institute that lasts a few years. But in general, that's not what occurred. We only see change when conservative media, like Fox, started to expose what was happening on campus during the Great Awakening. Confidence in higher education amongst Republican voters collapsed from 55% in 2015 to 20% by the 2020s. So you had this drop in confidence in higher education. That helped then to allow Republican governors, led by Ron DeSantis, to take action against DEI at state level and to bear down on the universities. We then had the October 7th congressional hearings, and it was the hauling in of Liz McGill and Claudine Gay into those hearings, and it was the exposure that allowed for the change that later came. The trustees who'd been passive and allowed the universities to do whatever they want suddenly woke up. The donors woke up. We started to see op-eds all of a sudden in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, all of a sudden saying, oh, well, political neutrality, that might be a good idea if universities didn't take political positions against Trump in favor of Black Lives Matter and all these other things. Pano Canelos, the president of the University of Austin, was telling me he was at a meeting of 60 presidents, and they were all talking about political neutrality, and they were doing this not because they suddenly woke up, it's because of the political pressure from the outside. So, to conclude, persuasion is not enough. You need sticks as well as carrots, and Trump and Musk may be a wrecking ball, and I think they've done a lot of terrible things, and I'm not positive about where their administration is going. However, I think on balance, the end result of what they have been doing on DEI, on higher education, will be positive for academic freedom. Thank you.
So first of all, I should say I probably agree with 70 or 80% of what Eric just said, except for the conclusion. But we'll come to that later when we discuss it. So Eric's right. Tonight's topic is not Trump in general, it's Trump and academic freedom. But I do have to say at the outset, with Donald Trump in power for the next 4 years, academic freedom is really the least of my worries. I'm much more concerned about truth, about democracy and the rule of law, and more generally about sanity, and not to say nothing about Trump's appalling conduct of foreign policy. So let's start with truth. We all know that lots of politicians have a challenged relationship with truth, but Trump is simply off the scale. The problem's not just hundreds of minor lies like those concerning the size of his 2017 inauguration, or Haitian immigrants in Ohio supposedly stealing and eating pets. It's big lies, like insisting he won the 2020 election and calling the January 6th riots a day of love. As one incisive 20th century political thinker observed, condescendingly, but I think in some instances accurately, he said, "In the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility. The broad masses of a nation more readily fall victims to the big lie than the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies in little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts which prove this to be so may be brought clearly to their minds, they will still doubt and waver, and will continue to think that there may be some other explanation. For the grossly impudent lie always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down, a fact which is known to all expert liars in this world. I'll let you figure out who that thinker was. For the same reason, one may worry that Trump 2.0 will follow the playbook of Viktor Orban and Recep Erdogan in harnessing the power of the state to harass and economically cripple his opponents and critics, or simply to intimidate them into acquiescence, in packing the courts with compliant judges and using those courts to prosecute and further harass his political adversaries, as his new FBI director has openly vowed to do, in using executive actions to override duly enacted laws or even the Constitution, daring anyone to challenge him in court, and potentially in refusing to comply at all with court decisions when they go against him. And last but not least, one may worry about the sanity of public discourse when the president muses openly and out of the blue about invading Greenland and Panama, comments that have not gone unnoticed by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and renaming the Gulf of Mexico. Now, perhaps this penchant for bizarre public remarks reflects nothing more than a narcissist's feeling of entitlement to blabber on about whatever crosses his mind. But I think that might underestimate Trump's cleverness, and it actually is a calculated strategy to keep his critics off balance, flooding the news cycle with loony comments that divert everyone's attention from the more serious actions being taken behind the scenes. But either way, it's not exactly a socially beneficial way to exercise the most powerful office in the world. Okay, now how does all this affect academic freedom? Well, for starters, the traditional liberal justification for academic freedom is based on a conception of scholarship in university teaching as committed to an honest search for truth, a respect for evidence and reasoned argument, and the valuing of good faith debate and viewpoint diversity. Moreover, academic freedom is buttressed in practice by robust legal guarantees for the freedom of expression. A president who disdains truth and the rule of law and who routinely treats his critics with ad hominem insults is unlikely to be an ally for academic freedom, to put it mildly. But should we have more specific worries, what does the Trump administration plan to do with higher education in general and academic freedom in particular? On the one hand, Heterodox Academy President John Tomasi took, or at least pretended to take, a friendly and optimistic stance in his January 20th letter to Trump. He listed a number of steps that Trump could take to promote viewpoint diversity in higher education and to require institutions to conform their free speech policies to established Supreme Court jurisprudence. But on the other hand, I think what one can plausibly fear, along with New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg, that Trump intends to use the power of the federal government to crush the academic left and remake higher education in a right-wing direction, following the game plan of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, right-wing activist Christopher Rufo, and their allies. So let me give you two examples, if I have time. I hope I don't run out of time. Yeah. How many? 5 minutes. 5 minutes, okay. So, for instance, Trump's executive order on ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling mixes sensible efforts to end indoctrination in one ideology, namely woke ideas concerning race and gender, with blatant attempts to impose indoctrination in a different ideology. On the one hand, the order purports to praise critical thinking, but then it goes on to demand that schools, quote, instill a patriotic admiration for our incredible nation and, quote, celebration of America's greatness and history. Schools are told to provide, quote, an accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling characterization of America's founding and foundational principles. Overlooking the accurate and honest might, in some instances, conflict with ennobling. The order instructs federal departments to eliminate federal funding that, quote, directly or indirectly supports or subsidizes the instruction, advancement, or promotion of gender ideology or discriminatory equity ideology, running roughshod over the key distinction between teaching about ideas and indoctrinating in ideas, which Helen has written a brilliant article about. And one may worry that similar pressures will soon be brought also on higher education, using once again the hammer of federal funding on which most universities are utterly dependent. Another worry concerns debate about Israel and Palestine. Trump's recent executive order takes specific aim at institutions of higher education and instigates them to, quote, monitor for and report activities by alien students and staff, so that means anyone other than a U.S. citizen, even a green card holder, that might render them deportable under existing law. That law covers any non-citizen who, quote, endorses or espouses terrorist activity or persuades others to endorse or espouse terrorist activity or support a terrorist organization, where the nature of support is never defined. So the risk, of course, is that people will self-censor in order to avoid being accused of supporting Hamas. That is, self-censor far beyond what the law actually requires were it to be tested in court. Moreover, instilling that fear is presumably not a bug, but a feature. And even more appalling is Trump's recent threatening tweet, which Anna quoted and which Helen is going to analyze a bit in detail. Now, fairness does require me to point to one positive thing that Trump has done, which may perhaps have some indirect effect on academic freedom, and that's his executive order about defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth. This document is an eloquent defense of both women's rights and biological reality. It could easily have been written by a pro-science, gender-critical feminist such as myself. It wasn't, but it could have been. And as Richard Dawkins commented with his usual pithiness, in my opinion, Donald Trump is a loathsome individual, utterly unfit to be president. But his statement that, quote, sex is determined at conception and is based on the size of the gamete that the resulting individual will produce is accurate in every particular. Perhaps the only true statement he ever made. Of course, I don't delude myself into thinking that Trump has any principled attachment to either women's rights or scientific truth. He's repeatedly proven in the past his disdain for both women and science. Quite simply, in this case, Trump has accurately figured out the moderate and sensible position that most Americans support. I'm deeply disappointed that the Democratic Party has resolutely refused to do this. It's depressing. The sanity on this issue has to come from a Republican Party that is, in nearly all other respects, deeply insane. Yeah, one more minute. So I should say there's one point in this executive order that could have a serious negative effect on academic freedom. I just want to draw attention to it. Section 3G provides that federal funds should not be used to promote gender ideology. Each agency shall assess grant conditions and grantee preferences and ensure grant funds do not promote gender ideology. Well, that, I think, is a sensible requirement concerning federal grants for the provision of social or health services. But if applied to research grants, it would constitute a dangerous infringement on academic freedom. Now, that concerns not only researchers in the humanities and social sciences who might want to advocate aspects of gender identity ideology, it also imposes an anti-scientific constraint on medical researchers who might want to investigate the causes and treatments for gender dysphoria. And in fact, scientists at the Centers for Disease Control have already been ordered to withdraw research papers that might inculcate gender ideology. And just one sentence. So I just want to say, even with regard to the former group, I don't want to silence my ideological adversaries by defunding them. I want to defeat them in the court of public opinion by reasoned argument. So this provision should be amended to exclude research grants. But I doubt that the Trump administration will do that, because the Trump administration does want to silence its ideological adversaries by defunding them.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Edward, and the members of the group for putting this wonderful debate on. It's just terrific to see academic freedom alive and well again in the beating heart of the University of London. Great to be with you. I'm the wingman tonight to Professor Kaufman. He has made very, very eloquent points with which I am in furious agreement. I'm just going to restrict myself, if I can, in the time available, I haven't got a clock in front of me, to 10 quick reasons as to why Trump is going to be positive for academic freedom, not just in the United States, but all across the West. And I'm going to just start with 9 points, which are really just sort of dull policy points. But I think it's the 10th argument, the 10th point, that dwarfs the first 9. And it's got really nothing to do with policy at all. But let's get through the policy questions. First of all, funding. Trump 1.0 was very explicit in tying federal funding to universities' commitment to academic freedom. It's kind of popular now. It was not a popular thing to do in 2016. It was Trump contra mundum. Thank God for his narcissism. Thank God for his egomania. Nobody else would have had the gumption to take on the blob that is higher ed, not just in the US, but as we know on this panel, all across the UK too. And that actually did seem to have some effect. It certainly got the debate. In at the centre of the public square. And it's important to note that funding and freedom are distinct. Academic freedom, it protects the content of research and teaching, not the means to conduct it. It should not be for the American taxpayer to subsidize institutions that are demonizing perfectly reasonable common sense views held by tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of American citizens. Perfectly proper. Second argument, enforcement. Again, Trump 1.0 and I think Trump 2.0 too said, if you as a university are going to cancel or set your Antifa mobs on visiting speakers who are exercising their lawful right to freedom of speech and academic freedom, and students who are gathering and exercising their right to freedom of association under the First Amendment, you're going to get sued. And the Department of Justice sued the University of Berkeley, and that had a chastening effect on the University of Berkeley and a number of other universities too. Perfectly reasonable, nothing unlawful about it, nothing crazy about that at all, just ordinary due process. Third, protests. Now, I know this is a controverted, neuralgic issue, and the law and order agenda is not popular certainly on the academic left. But the fact is, look, free speech is not the same as academic freedom. This debate is about academic freedom, which is a species of free speech. It's not coterminous with free speech. Academic freedom is specifically the legal requirement to ensure that intellectual cultures are free and flourishing places for diverse, plural, and contentious perspectives. We've had this debate in Cambridge, so I remained silent when the Palestinian protests set up on King's Parade outside King's College. That was, to my mind, if the fellows of King's College, Cambridge, as you would expect them to be, were completely happy with pro-Palestinian encampments outside, absolutely fine. I refused to sign some of the letters that were going around among colleagues to contest that. However, when they started to disrupt graduation ceremonies, make it difficult for access to library, access to exams, and so on, that crossed a red line. Why? Yes, they were exercising their free speech, they weren't breaking the law, but they were disrupting the ordinary business of the university. They were making it impossible for academic freedom to be protected for both students and staff. Trump gets that, thank goodness. And frankly, if you're breaking the law, vandalism, harassment, the First Amendment does not protect you. Tough. Next point, accreditation. Accreditation for a long time in the United States has been dominated by a radical left monopoly. That is going to be broken down by Trump 2.0, and that's going to allow other universities to set up. The University of Austin in Texas, Ralston College in Savannah. Look, we're only talking half a dozen. I mean, this is not exactly a re-tipping of the balance, but it's a beginning. And one of the ways we can do that is to ensure that there's ideological breadth when it comes to those immense powers of degree conferring powers on institutions. Next argument, dismantling the Department of Education. Can't wait for this one. It's a $200 billion a year racket. It's a bureaucracy that oversees federal student aid, research grants, and compliance rules like Title IX. It is completely under the control of one very dominant ideology that locks out at least half of the American people who are subsidizing all this. It's going to push down autonomy to the local state level for universities. That's going to surely be conducive or more conducive to fostering a diversity of perspective and create a more plural pedagogical culture all across the United States. Next argument, they're going to be reforming research funding. Thank God for that too. You've got a $40 billion annual pot for the National Institute of the Humanities. That's going to face a cap, not a drastic cap, sadly, only 15%, but the executive orders from last month are already mandating purging of DEI from curricula, and basically a template for broader reform. We can talk about that a little bit later. Next argument, parental and school choice. Now, I know Alan was talking about K through 12. That's not really academic freedom. Academic freedom begins at the university. You don't have academic freedom at school. That's the same in the UK, same in the US. You should have basically what the headmaster tells you to do is what you have to do, as a few teachers here in the UK have discovered to their cost. However, what is happening with Trump 2.0 is an emphasis on parental and school choice. Again, that's going to break ideological monopolies on school choice, and that's going to, I hope, foster thinkers who are going to be a little bit more skeptical of the ideological gatekeeping at the Ivy League level. One of Eric's great reports a couple of years ago, I remember, showed that a lot of the ideological groupthink is fixed. It's in by 18. There's not much we can do at university about the groupthink among the students. Your political outlook is pretty much forged at school. And so a loosening of that just through parental and school choice is surely a good thing. Ninth argument, taxing and suing university endowments. Can't wait for this one either. Trump targets, you've got $800 billion in private university endowment. Harvard alone, Harvard's basically a hedge fund with a university attached. It's got $50 billion. That's more than the combined endowments for all 150 universities in the UK. And we do incredibly well on almost nothing. 4 of the top 10 universities in the world for less than 20 billion, an absolute bargain. So what he's proposing to do is just tax those endowments and issue lawsuits to penalize institutions that prioritize woke agendas over education. So goodbye to the woke madrasas, or at least a weakening of the woke madrasas. Thank goodness for that. The ninth argument, penultimate argument, SCOTUS. So I think Trump's appointments is an oblique argument, but Trump's appointments over his first term, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett, has broadly led to some conservative majorities on that vital case. For example, last year we saw students for fair admissions in Harvard versus Harvard. Harvard was nakedly discriminating against Asian Americans solely on the basis of their ethnicity and race and skin color. It was appalling, absolutely disgusting that Harvard University should be getting away with that for decades. So thank goodness for Clarence Thomas, Amy Coney Barrett, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, all of those 3 Trump appointments. But finally, the final argument, as I come into land, is actually, I think, as I said, more important than any actual policy levers that Trump could bring to bear. And that's what the commentator Santiago Pliego has called the vibe shift. Anyone who's been to Washington since November the 5th last year will know what I'm talking about. There is a sense of freedom in the air, not constraint and coercion to believe a particular dogma, but a sense of you can just talk about these things. It's okay. Nobody's going to die. If you are critical of climate catastrophism, or if you think you can't castrate your way into the sisterhood, or if you've got qualms about mass unchecked immigration from the southern border bringing in drugs that are killing more people a year than the Vietnam War killed in 10 years. That vibe shift is basically the by far and away the most powerful antidote to the groupthink in these elite institutions. It's effectively putting them more, I say more on the back foot, because as Eric has shown, the groupthink is completely out of control. It's well over 85, 90, 95% in almost all disciplines, certainly in the humanities. And the trouble with groupthink is that wrong think becomes evil think. And you can demonize your opponents, and as it were, the sort of the polarized political landscape of the United States gets more and more polarized. A perfectly sensible solution to this, by the way, and it's working here at Michaela School up in North London, is a soft stress on what binds us together. And one of the things that does bind us together across the political divide is soft patriotism. Look, may have criticisms of our nation, we may not like that bit of it, not like that bit of it, but look, we're in it together. It's the one thing we've got in common. Let's try and find the good bits that stitch us together and stop us tearing each other's throats out. Thank you all.
So in the Counterweight Handbook, I argued that publicly funded universities must be reformed to make them fit for the purpose of knowledge production. And this requires the active mitigation of ideological bias. So there are two methods for this. We can prohibit the ideology, or we can prohibit the bias. Banning ideas doesn't work. We've just seen that here in the UK with wokeness, which tried hardest to suppress gender-critical feminism and criticisms of immigration. So did this work? Prohibiting things as non-crime hate incidents and removing them from mainstream society? Well, from a country now known worldwide as Turf Island, in which reform has just kind of catapulted itself through the mainstream parties at an astonishing rate, I'd have to say no, that didn't work. In the US, countless surveys indicate that wokeness was highly influential on the election of Donald Trump. So banning ideas doesn't work. It is more ethical and effective to ban the bias. It is clearly better in the immediate and direct sense for freedom of speech and academic freedom. However, establishing anti-bias policies also thinks long-term, while banning ideas perpetuates a system in which academics have to wait to see who wins an election before they know which ideas they'll be able to have for the next political term. Most importantly, academic freedom is also the way to genuinely defeat bad ideas, rather than forcing them into alternative spaces while increasing sympathy for them and allowing them to explode again as soon as the time is ripe. I argue that universities should be required to show that their courses include competing hypotheses and academics with a range of political views from different schools of thought and fields. For example, a course on gender studies would need to show that it did not only include queer theories on gender, but also gender-critical feminists and biologists as most directly relevant. I suspect that this would, in practice, cause most queer theorists to resign, but they would not have been pushed out, so they would not be able to claim the glamour of being oppressed or silenced and gain the sympathy of the public. Those who chose to remain and present their ideas alongside gender-critical and biological sciences would, I suspect, find that they didn't shape up that well. This is how academia is intended to root out failing theories. Mr. Trump has the opportunity now to establish this kind of system that protects academic freedom and begin the process of dismantling woke properly. Is he doing so? I don't think so. We see signs of overreach already, such as the detention of Mahmoud Khalil after he took part in a pro-Palestine sit-in at Columbia University, and activists online called for the removal of his visa, even though he has a green card. He's still in detention. FIRE is currently helping students across 11 Texas campuses oppose an unconstitutional ban on drag performances on the grounds that it demeans women, promotes gender ideology, and runs contrary to their values. However, at the moment, we're still primarily seeing a lot of intimidating but non-specific rhetoric. To take that highly alarming post that Anna quoted earlier, all federal funding will stop for any college, school or university that allows illegal protests. Agitators will be imprisoned or permanently sent back to the country from which they came. American students will be permanently expelled or, depending on the crime, arrested. No masks. What does this mean? It's specific on the dire consequences, but not on prohibited actions. It says illegal protests, but protests are legal. So what precisely does it mean? It is agitators who will be penalised, but agitators mean people who urge others to protest. Organising or posting about a protest cannot be illegal, can it? And if we don't know what is banned or what actions are considered agitating, what does it mean for a university to allow it? Does it mean giving the explicit all clear to unambiguous crimes like violence? Or does it mean that if a college allows posters about a protest to go up and a protester breaks something, they have allowed an illegal protest? Nobody knows, and this, many are arguing, is the point. Timothy Snyder's concept of anticipatory obedience is being heard frequently in response to this. This refers to people responding to intimidating yet vague, threatening rhetoric of dire consequences for something which is not well defined, by taking steps to stop doing anything which could be covered by it. In this way, it works quite a lot like non-crime hate incidents. By sounding intimidating and official, but being so non-specific, its main function is to make people fearful while keeping them uncertain about whether they are actually breaking the law or not. The American Association of University Professors is one of several voices urging people not to engage in anticipatory obedience, and highlighting the ways in which universities appear to already be self-censoring. Florida State University is reviewing all its course content for anti-Semitic or anti-Israel bias. The University of North Texas censored over 200 academic courses, mandating the removal of words like race, gender, class, and equity from course titles. Arizona State and North Carolina State have required academics to stop any federally funded research that could be considered DEI related. Florida has cut general education courses that refer to race or gender. Northeastern University has changed references to diversity, equity, and inclusion to belonging. Georgia Tech is deleting all content that includes any word related to DEI. Meanwhile, biomedical research agencies have been withdrawing manuscript submissions to remove terms like gender and transgender while taking down their data sets from public view. There is a lot of potential for collateral damage here. Not all courses or content that relate to race or gender are DEI related. Some of it seems to be history. Class also applies to important social issues outside of wokeness. Scholars in international relations may at times need to criticise Israel. I fear that making it harder to find scholarship into theories of gender will make life harder for gender-critical feminists trying to show the problems with it. And the removal of biomedical data for scientific publications could hinder organisations like GenSpect addressing science that allegedly justifies the medicalisation of children and being able to show why it doesn't. Further, this seems like the perfect recipe for making the very academics and activists whose ideas we need to address to bunker down, hide their ideas on campus, grow them in alternative spaces, garner public sympathy, and be ready to reseed in 4 years when they hope the left to be in the ascendant again. It's public sympathy that will make the left ascendant again. Trump won very narrowly, and a lot of this was because those who oppose authoritarianism had finally been convinced that woke is authoritarian. Russ Douthat addressed this potential danger well. Identifying liberals correctly as free speech oriented, he wrote, "In the Trump years, we saw that in an atmosphere of political emergency, many liberals struggled to resist demands of ideological fealty made by movements to their left. Now the emergency mentality has retreated, resistance and scepticism are easier. But what if it comes back under a Trump restoration or in some other form? If liberals accept loyalty oaths under calm conditions, what will they accept in emergency? Probably too much. In which case, the next case of wokeness will be higher, the next revolution more complete." My observation is that this is starting to happen. Just as people wrote to me when wokeness exploded in 2020, I'm hearing increasingly from people now feeling a need to confess to me why they can no longer support the anti-woke and why they feel that if they have to go with one, wokeness is better. I see an atmosphere of political emergency forming, as Douthat describes, and this is supported by polls showing Trump's popularity to have plummeted to the lowest of any president ever, except himself last time. My fear is that by squashing academic freedom from the right, rather than implementing policies to protect it consistently, Trump will drive wokeness into hiding for 4 years, while also increasing sympathy for it. I fear he is silencing bad ideas rather than providing the opportunity to defeat them, and causing a lot of illiberal collateral damage on the way. There is the risk that when his term is over, we will see a backlash, in which people will vote for a left within which sympathy for the woke has reignited, and will again get illiberal left-wing policies that will clamp down on academic freedom. And so the pendulum will swing. I hope that I'm wrong about this. We're still in the early stages, we're still in a lot of rhetoric, but from the rhetoric that we're seeing right now, from the attitudes we're seeing right now, I would have to say, is Trump good for academic freedom? I don't think so.